On a quiet summer night, the American dream turned into a nightmare. A husband, a father, a seemingly perfect family. But behind closed doors, a dark secret was about to unravel. In a twisted act of betrayal and rage, Chris Watts murdered his pregnant wife, Sean and their two young daughters. What drove a man to obliterate the family he once claimed to love? This is the chilling and tragic truth behind the Watts family murders. Welcome to Crime of Passion. Tonight, we invite you to unwind, settle into your most comfortable spot, and let the weight of the world slip away. Dim the lights, take a deep breath, and allow the soothing rhythm of this story to ease you into a peaceful state. Before you drift into a night of restful sleep, take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and comment, helping others discover these stories as you relax. You might think you know where this is going, but just let go and let the details unfold slowly, softly. This is a tale of tangled emotions, quiet betrayals, and a tragedy that could have been avoided, but wasn't. So, relax, let the tension fade, and drift into the story, one gentle step at a time. The Watts family seemed like a classic picture of the American dream. On the outside, they were everything people admired, successful, attractive, and seemingly happy. They lived in a beautiful home in Frederick, Colorado, with a picturesque view of the Rocky Mountains, and their lives were full of what appeared to be love, family, and prosperity. Shawn Watts, the 34-year-old mother of two, and her husband Chris, a 33-year-old father, embodied the idealized notion of the perfect family. Their two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, added to the idyllic picture, often seen in cheerful, brightly colored family photos, smiling faces, and vacation snapshots. Shawn, known for her larger-than-life personality, had spent years building her life from the ground up. Diagnosed with lupus, she worked tirelessly to provide for her family while also dealing with the health challenges that came with her condition. Despite the physical toll of lupus, Shawn never let her illness define her. Instead, she poured her energy into her family, her faith, and her career. Her health struggles made her more resilient, and she became a source of support and inspiration to many, often sharing her journey on social media. Shawn was a dedicated mother, and her kids were always her top priority. She was known for her loving and nurturing nature, a side of her that radiated through every post, every photo, and every word she shared with the world. Chris Watts, on the other hand, was the more reserved figure in the family. He worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, and although he wasn't as present on social media as Shawn, his appearances painted the picture of a loving father and husband. He shared pictures of his family, celebrating milestones, vacations, and the simple moments of joy that came with raising his daughters. To the outside world, Chris was the perfect partner, hardworking, kind, and completely devoted to his wife and children. They had a life many people envied. The family had built a comfortable home in Frederick, Colorado, where they enjoyed spending time together in their suburban haven. On paper, the Watts family had it all: the house, the cars, the children, the happy marriage. But as with many things in life, appearances can be deceiving. Behind the smiles and the social media posts, there were cracks in the facade that only the people closest to Shawn and Chris could see. Shawn had begun to notice subtle changes in Chris's behavior. He was becoming more withdrawn, emotionally distant, and preoccupied. She tried to rationalize it, attributing it to the pressures of work or the stress of raising a family. But the distance between them was becoming too noticeable to ignore. Her instinct told her something wasn't right. Chris had started spending more time away from the family. While Shawn was at home with their two young daughters, Chris was often absent, either working late or going out without explanation. They weren't the romantic partners they had once been. The warm, affectionate man who had wooed Shawn and had been a dedicated father seemed to be slipping away. Shawn felt this distance, but she didn't want to admit to herself that their marriage might be in trouble. She continued to post about their seemingly happy family, but even she couldn't ignore the increasing void in her relationship with Chris. In early August 2018, Shannon left for a business trip to Arizona. It was a much-needed break for her, a chance to focus on her career and recharge away from the responsibilities of motherhood. But even during her time away, she continued to feel that something wasn't right between her and Chris. They had spoken briefly during her trip, and while Chris was polite, there was an underlying tension in their conversations. Still, Shannon tried to remain optimistic. She hoped that their issues were just temporary, a result of stress or miscommunication, and that things would improve once she returned. Chris, however, had already made up his mind. He had been carrying on a secret affair with Nickel Kessinger, a coworker he had met at Anadarko Petroleum. The affair had started in the months leading up to Shannon's death, and by the time Shannon left for Arizona, Chris was deeply involved with Nickel. The connection he felt with her was different. He described it as something he hadn't experienced before. A feeling of excitement, of being wanted, and a sense of freedom that he believed was missing in his marriage. Chris's infidelity wasn't just a fleeting affair. It was something he had already started planning around. He was falling out of love with Shannon, and the emotional attachment he had to Nickel made him feel as though he had a way out. His decision was becoming clearer by the day. He wanted a fresh start, and in his mind, the only way to achieve that was to rid himself of the family he had once built. He couldn't bring himself to confront Shannon about his feelings, so instead, he made the choice to keep his affair a secret and allow the situation to escalate. As Shannon returned home to Colorado on the evening of August 13, 2018, she was unaware of the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. She arrived to a home that felt colder, more distant than it ever had before. Chris greeted her with a brief kiss, but there was an unmistakable awkwardness between them. Shannon, ever the optimist, tried to push away her growing concerns. She was happy to be home with her children, and she was hopeful that this tension between her and Chris would soon pass. However, that evening would prove to be the turning point in their relationship. As they sat down to talk, Shannon brought up the emotional distance she had been feeling. She confronted Chris about his behavior, about the coldness that had been growing between them. The conversation quickly escalated into an argument. Shannon pressed him about his lack of affection and his increasing time away from home. In the midst of this confrontation, Shannon asked Chris if he was seeing someone else. Chris denied it, but Shannon's intuition told her that something was terribly wrong. The conversation reached an impasse, with Chris refusing to be open about the truth. Shannon was hurt, confused, and deeply frustrated, but she tried to maintain composure. That night, Shannon went to bed exhausted, still holding out hope that things would get better, that their marriage could be salvaged. But she had no idea that Chris had already decided that there was no turning back. She had no way of knowing that while she was sleeping, Chris would make the darkest decision of his life. A decision that would end the lives of not only Shannon but also their two young daughters, Bella and Celeste. The night of August 13, 2018, started like any other evening for Shannon Watts. She returned home from her business trip in Arizona, eager to reconnect with her family, especially her husband, Chris, and their two daughters, Bella and Celeste. It was supposed to be a joyful reunion, coming back to the family after a few days away. But there was something in the air that night, something uneasy, that Shannon couldn't shake. As she walked through the door, she noticed the distance in Chris's eyes, the lack of warmth she had once felt from him. The conversation started innocently enough, with Shannon trying to catch up on the days she had missed. But as soon as she confronted Chris about his strange behavior, the increasing emotional distance between them, the conversation turned tense. It was as if Shannon's fears had been confirmed. Her intuition, which had been nagging her for weeks, was right. Chris was no longer the man she married. The man who had once showered her with affection and love was now a shadow of himself. Shannon, who had always prided herself on being open and honest, pushed harder. She wanted answers. She wanted to understand why Chris had changed. The argument escalated when Shannon asked him directly if he was having an affair. She had seen the signs. The secrecy, the late nights, the emotional coldness. Chris, who had been withdrawn for weeks, seemed to shut down entirely when confronted with the question. He denied it, of course. He told her it was all in her head, that everything was fine, and that she was just overreacting. But the look in his eyes said something different. It wasn't just the affair that Sean and suspected. It was the deeper feeling of betrayal. She had spent so many years building a life with Chris, raising their 2 daughters, and fighting through her health struggles. She had given everything to this marriage, and now it felt like it was slipping away right before her eyes. But Chris wasn't willing to open up to her. He wasn't willing to share the truth. The argument went on into the night. Sean tried to remain calm, but her heart was breaking. Every word Chris spoke seemed to drive a wedge between them. The man she had loved for years, her partner, her husband, the father of her children, was now a stranger. But she couldn't bring herself to accept the truth. She didn't want to. The thought of her marriage crumbling, of her family being torn apart, was too painful to bear. By the time they both retired to bed, the air between them was thick with unresolved tension. Sean lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The conversation replayed in her head over and over. She couldn't understand why Chris was acting this way. Why was he so distant? Was it really just stress? Or was there something more? Despite the uncertainty gnawing at her, she eventually drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the emotional toll the evening had taken. But in the hours that followed, a horrific reality was about to unfold. A reality that Sean could never have imagined in her wildest dreams. The man who had vowed to love her, to cherish her, had already made a decision that would change their lives forever. It was just after 1:30 a.m. when Chris made his move. As Sean slept beside him, unaware of what was coming, Chris's thoughts were no longer those of a husband trying to salvage his marriage. They had shifted to something darker. The decision that had been simmering in his mind for weeks had reached its boiling point. Shanann's confrontation about his affair, her suspicions, her demand for the truth, everything had led to this moment. The affair with Nicole Kessinger had been a lifeline for Chris. It had given him an escape, a sense of freedom from the responsibilities he no longer wanted to bear. The connection he felt with Nicole was one that Sean couldn't provide, and as Chris grew more emotionally distant from his wife, the affair intensified. He had fallen for Nicole, and in his mind, his future lay with her. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, but he also couldn't face the reality of ending his marriage with Sean. He had created a web of lies, and now he felt trapped. But instead of confronting Sean, Chris chose a far darker path. He made the decision to eliminate the source of his problems. In his mind, it wasn't about murder. It was about his own freedom, about starting a new life with Nicole, free from the constraints of his family. He saw no other way out. The act itself was quick. Chris smothered Sean with a blanket while she slept, her body vulnerable and unaware. The love of his life, the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin, was now at his mercy. As she struggled to breathe, Chris watched her life slip away. The woman he had once loved reduced to a lifeless body in their bed. The crime was swift, but the impact would be felt for a lifetime. But Sean wasn't the only one who would suffer. Their 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste, were still asleep in their beds, completely unaware of the horror unfolding in the next room. As Chris looked at Shanann's body, a strange calm came over him. He knew what he had to do next. Chris wasn't just going to murder his wife, he was going to kill his children, too. The decision to kill Bella and Celeste didn't come from a moment of panic. It wasn't a rash decision made in the heat of the moment. It was cold, calculated. Chris had already made up his mind. He couldn't have his daughters growing up without their mother and without the father they knew. He couldn't bear the thought of them living with the truth of what he had done. So he methodically carried each of them, Bella, who was 4, and Celeste, who was only 3, out to his truck. Their innocence, their laughter, their love for their father would mean nothing in the end. He smothered both of them, just as he had done with Sean before disposing of their bodies in the oil tanks at the Anadarko petroleum site. The brutality of Chris's actions was staggering. He didn't just murder his wife and daughters. He obliterated the entire family he had once claimed to love. He destroyed everything, all in the name of an affair that had consumed him, of a desire to escape the reality he had built for himself. But as he disposed of their bodies, there was no satisfaction, no sense of relief. In the quiet aftermath, there was only emptiness, and perhaps, for the first time, Chris truly realized the weight of what he had done. The quiet morning of August 14th, 2018, was a sharp contrast to the horrific events that had transpired just hours before. Chris Watts, having killed his wife and children, now faced the daunting task of covering his tracks. The peaceful suburban neighborhood in Frederick, Colorado, was about to be thrown into chaos. What began as a seemingly typical family day would quickly turn into a desperate search for answers. Shannon Watts had been reported missing by her friend, Nicole Atkinson, around 1:40 p.m. on August 13, 2018. Nicole had last seen Sean earlier that morning when she had left for an appointment. After Sean didn't respond to her texts and calls, Nicole grew concerned and went to Shanann's house to check on her. When she arrived, she found Shanann's car in the driveway, her purse still inside, and the front door unlocked. Most alarmingly, Shanann's phone was still on the counter, indicating she hadn't left willingly. Nicole immediately called the police, and within hours, a full-scale search for Sean and Watts was underway. As police arrived at the Watts home, they were met with a father who appeared calm, almost eerily so under the circumstances. Chris Watts, dressed in a dark t-shirt and jeans, spoke with officers about his wife's disappearance. He explained that he hadn't seen Sean since the night before and that he didn't know where she could be. He claimed that they had argued but that they had gone to bed without any further conflict. Chris said he woke up the next morning to find his wife missing and the children gone as well. But there was something off about Chris's demeanor. His voice was flat, his answers seemed rehearsed, and his emotions didn't match the gravity of the situation. Sean pregnant with their third child, had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Shouldn't he have been more distraught? Shouldn't he have been pleading for her safe return? Instead, Chris appeared to be just going through the motions, as if trying to keep up appearances. As the police began their investigation, they quickly realized that Chris's story didn't entirely add up. The more they probed, the more inconsistencies emerged. For one, Chris claimed he didn't know where Sean had gone, yet he seemed to have no problem offering a detailed timeline of the events that had occurred earlier in the day. He explained that Sean had returned home from her trip to Arizona, and they had had a brief discussion before going to bed, but he couldn't provide any details about the night or about what had happened between the two of them. The investigation into Shanann's disappearance took a darker turn when the police learned about Chris's extramarital affair with Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker from his job at Anadarko Petroleum. Chris had been having an affair with Nicole for months, and they had even made plans to start a life together once he was free from Sean. This revelation only added to the suspicions surrounding Chris's involvement in his wife's disappearance. His behavior and demeanor were becoming more and more suspicious as the hours passed. As police combed through the Watts home, they found evidence that pointed to foul play. Shanann's phone, which had been left behind, contained numerous text messages and voicemails between her and Chris in the days leading up to her death. In the messages, Sean expressed concern about Chris's emotional distance and questioned him about his behavior. One of her final messages to her friend Nicole had been sent that morning before she disappeared, saying she was having a rough day and that she had a lot to think about. There was an underlying tension in these texts, a sense of foreboding that now seemed all too real. Chris's lies began to unravel when the police conducted a thorough search of the property. They reviewed security footage from the neighborhood, and what they discovered was damning. The footage captured Chris's truck leaving the driveway early that morning, around 5:27 a.m., just hours after Shanann's murder. The timing was significant. Chris had already disposed of Shanann's body and their daughter's bodies, but he hadn't accounted for this crucial detail. When questioned about the truck leaving the house, Chris claimed that he had gone to work early, but he couldn't explain why he had driven his truck to the site so early in the morning. As investigators continued to build their case, Chris's story began to shift. He was confronted with the overwhelming evidence against him, the security footage, his inconsistent timeline, and the mounting suspicion surrounding his extramarital affair. Faced with this mounting pressure, Chris finally cracked. On August 15, 2018, just 2 days after the murders, Chris Watts was taken into custody and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for Sean and one for each of their 2 daughters. During his confession, Chris admitted to everything. He confessed to killing Sean and in a fit of rage, after an argument about his affair and his desire to leave her. He said that after he murdered Sean he went into Bella and Celeste's room and smothered them, before disposing of their bodies in an oil field. His confession was chilling. He spoke of the murders as if they were a detached, emotionless act, something he had decided to do without any regard for the gravity of his actions. Chris claimed that he was overwhelmed with guilt, but there was no remorse in his voice. The man who had once been a loving father and husband had been transformed into someone unrecognizable. What had driven him to murder his entire family? Was it the affair? His desire for a new life? Or was there something deeper at play? An unchecked darkness within him that had been simmering for years? The details of the confession were almost too horrific to comprehend. The murders were not spontaneous acts of violence, but rather cold, calculated decisions made over time. Sean had been killed first, smothered with a blanket in their bed. Then, Chris moved on to Bella and Celeste, his daughters, carrying them one by one to the truck, where he disposed of their tiny bodies in an oil tank at the Anadarko petroleum site. The brutality of these actions left investigators speechless. A man who had once seemed so kind, so normal, had become capable of the unthinkable. Chris's confession was only the beginning of the shocking revelations that would come in the days and weeks ahead. The Watts family's murder case quickly became a media sensation, with reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and the public all eager to understand what had driven Chris Watts to kill his family. The news cycle was filled with speculation, and the details of the case were dissected endlessly. How could a father, a husband, a man who seemed to have everything, commit such a monstrous act? For Shanann's family and friends, the pain of losing her and her 2 young daughters was overwhelming. Shanann's mother, Sandy Razusek, had lost not only her daughter but also her 2 granddaughters. Shanann's friends, who had watched her struggle with her marriage and her health, were left with a feeling of deep disbelief and heartbreak. How could they have missed the signs? How could they have not known that the man Sean had married had been harboring such darkness inside? As the news of Chris's confession spread, the case became a media sensation. People were captivated by the tragedy, drawn into the details of the Watts family's seemingly perfect life, which had been ripped apart by betrayal, rage, and selfishness. Chris Watts, the man who had once been a symbol of the American family, had become one of the most reviled criminals in the country. The case raised questions about the dangers of emotional manipulation, the impact of toxic relationships, and the extent to which someone could hide their true nature behind a facade. Shanann's family was devastated, but they also began to speak out, determined to honor the memory of their daughter and granddaughters. They fought to make sure that Shanann's legacy would not be defined by Chris's actions, but by the love and kindness she had given to those around her. Shanann's memory became a symbol of the danger of ignoring red flags in relationships, and her story served as a warning to others who might be trapped in toxic relationships of their own. The case would go on to inspire numerous documentaries, books, and media coverage, shining a light on the disturbing reality of domestic violence and the darkness that can lurk in even the most seemingly perfect of homes. The confession of Chris Watts had only been the beginning of the nightmare. While the community and the world tried to process the unimaginable tragedy, the legal system would now step in, demanding justice for the 3 innocent lives that had been lost: Sean and Bella and Celeste. The case was no longer just about the murder of a family. It had become a haunting commentary on the lies, manipulations, and secrets that had led to such a brutal act. Chris Watts's arrest and the subsequent media frenzy turned his case into one of the most publicized and talked about trials in recent memory. The stark contrast between the loving family man he had once appeared to be and the monster he had revealed himself to be only deepened the shock and grief that surrounded the case. For many, the most chilling part wasn't just the murders themselves. It was the fact that they had occurred at the hands of someone who had once seemed so ordinary, so typical, and who had hidden his true nature behind the facade of a perfect husband and father. The trial for Chris Watts began in late 2018, just months after the horrific murders. The media attention was intense. Every detail of the case, from Chris's confession to the investigation that had uncovered his affair, was on display for the world to see. For Shanann's family, the trial became a painful, grueling process, but one that was necessary to ensure justice for their beloved daughter and granddaughters. Chris had pleaded guilty to the murders in a plea agreement that spared him from the death penalty, but the emotional toll of his actions was far from over. The trial itself focused on the victims, their lives, their personalities, and the tragedy of their loss. Shanann's family, her friends, and even the community that had once admired Chris now had to come to terms with the horror of what had transpired within the walls of the Watts family home. The prosecution painted a clear picture of a man driven by selfishness, desire, and cold rage. They argued that Chris had killed Shan and in a fit of fury after a confrontation about his affair, and that he had methodically disposed of her and their two daughters as if they were nothing more than obstacles standing in the way of his new life. The coldness of his actions was underscored by his lack of remorse, even in the courtroom. He offered no apologies, no emotional expressions of regret. His motives, his desire to leave his family and start over with his mistress, Nicole Kessinger, were clear. The defense, on the other hand, tried to paint Chris's actions as an outburst of passion and mental distress. They argued that Chris had been overwhelmed by the emotional weight of his situation. His affair, his growing frustration with his marriage, and the pressure of trying to live two lives simultaneously. But these arguments fell flat, especially given the premeditated nature of the crimes. Chris had planned every step. His decisions weren't born of a momentary outburst, but of months of secrecy, lies, and manipulation. For Shanann's family, the most painful part of the trial was hearing the full extent of Chris's betrayal. The affair, which had been hidden from Shan and had been a source of emotional destruction long before the murders. The fact that Chris had been planning to leave Shan and for Nicole, and had murdered his children to cover up his lies, left an unhealable wound in the hearts of Shanann's loved ones. As the trial progressed, Shanann's family members were given the opportunity to speak in court, each one delivering a poignant, heart-wrenching statement about the impact of Chris's actions. Shanann's mother, Sandy Razusek, spoke about her daughter's strength, her love for her children, and the deep sense of loss she felt in the wake of the tragedy. Her words were filled with sorrow, but also with a quiet resolve. She had lost not only her daughter but also her two granddaughters, children who had been taken from her far too soon. Sandy's heartbreak was palpable, and her words resonated with everyone in the courtroom. Shanann's father, Frank Razusek, also gave a moving statement. He spoke about how proud he had been of Shan and how she had overcome her health struggles and built a life full of love and dedication to her family. He was struggling with the reality that his daughter, who had worked so hard to build a happy home, had been taken from him in such a brutal, senseless way. The pain in his voice was raw, and his grief was clear. He had lost his daughter and his granddaughters, and nothing would ever fill the void. For Bella and Celeste's family, the devastation was equally profound. They had lost two innocent young girls whose lives had been filled with laughter, joy, and hope. Their absence left a hole in the hearts of everyone who had known them. The community, which had once rallied behind the Watts family, now mourned the loss of these two precious girls, whose lives had been stolen by the very man who was supposed to protect them. On November 19, 2018, Chris Watts was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was a relief to many, though it could never undo the destruction he had caused. The judge made it clear that the crimes Watts had committed were heinous and unforgivable. Chris would spend the rest of his life behind bars, but for Shanann's family, the reality was that no prison sentence could bring back the lives of Sean and Bella and Celeste. While the sentencing brought some closure, it didn't bring peace. The emotional scars left by the murders would take a lifetime to heal. Shanann's family had lost everything in the blink of an eye. The pain of her death and the loss of her children would stay with them forever. Chris's sentencing also sparked debates about the nature of his crime. Some argued that he deserved the death penalty, given the brutal, premeditated nature of his actions. Others, however, felt that life in prison without parole was the most fitting punishment. Regardless of the sentence, the tragedy of the Watts family's murder would never fade from the public's memory. The case of the Watts family murders sent shockwaves through the nation. It became one of the most talked about true crime stories of the decade. People couldn't understand how a seemingly perfect family could be torn apart by one man's cold-blooded decision to murder his wife and children. The case highlighted the dangers of hidden emotions, secret lives, and the destruction that can come when a person is driven by selfishness and greed. For Shanann's family, the tragedy was not only about their personal loss. It was also a cautionary tale about the dangers of domestic violence, emotional manipulation, and infidelity. Sean had been a loving, devoted wife and mother, but she had unknowingly been trapped in a toxic, abusive relationship with a man who had grown to resent her. The case raised awareness about the silent suffering that many people face in their relationships and the deadly consequences that can arise when someone is pushed to their breaking point. In the years that followed, Shanann's family worked tirelessly to honor her memory and the lives of her daughters. They created foundations, held memorials, and spoke out against domestic violence, hoping to prevent future tragedies like the one they had endured. They wanted the world to know that Sean and her girls were more than just victims. They were bright, loving individuals who had been taken far too soon. Chris Watts's crime was not just an isolated act of violence. It was a warning, a wake-up call to those who may be living in the shadow of toxic relationships. Shanann's story, the story of a woman who fought so hard to build a life for her family, will always be remembered. Her death, and the deaths of her daughters, serves as a tragic reminder that we never truly know what is happening behind closed doors. Chris Watts will live out the rest of his life in prison, but the pain he caused will continue to haunt those who loved Sean and Bella and Celeste. They will never be forgotten. Story 2. On Valentine's Day 2013, the world watched in shock as one of the most celebrated athletes in the world, Oscar Pistorius, was thrust into a nightmare that would shatter his career and his reputation. What was supposed to be a night of love and romance turned into a tragedy, as Pistorius fired 4 shots through a locked bathroom door, killing his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp. Was it a tragic accident? Or was it the dark result of a toxic relationship and uncontrolled rage? This is the shocking and heartbreaking truth behind the murder of Riva Steenkamp. Valentine's Day, 2013, was supposed to be a celebration of love, joy, and affection. A day for couples to share intimate moments and create lasting memories. However, for Oscar Pistorius, a world-renowned athlete, and his girlfriend Riva Steenkamp, this romantic evening would tragically mark the beginning of the end. What was meant to be an evening of affection turned into a devastating tragedy, one that would change the course of both their lives forever. Oscar Pistorius, a South African track and field Paralympian, had captivated the world with his inspiring story. Born without fibulas, Oscar became the first double amputee to compete in the Olympic Games. His remarkable achievements defied the odds, earning him the nickname Blade Runner due to the high-tech prosthetics he wore to race. He was a beloved figure, a symbol of perseverance, determination, and breaking barriers. However, beneath the public persona of the hero who inspired millions, a darker side of Oscar's character was slowly emerging. Riva Steenkamp, a beautiful 29-year-old model and law graduate, was far from just a pretty face. She was intelligent, passionate, and had a promising career ahead of her. Riva had a reputation for being kind, compassionate, and fiercely independent. At the time of her death, She was making a name for herself in the world of modeling and acting, but she was also deeply interested in charity work. Her relationship with Oscar had appeared to be one of love, with the couple regularly sharing affectionate photos and messages on social media. Friends and family described their relationship as loving, though some close to Riva began to express concerns about the dynamic between the two. In the weeks leading up to the fatal night, there had been subtle signs of strain in their relationship. Oscar had a history of volatile emotions, some of which had been exhibited during previous relationships. He had a reputation for being quick to anger and had allegedly had several incidents of aggressive behavior in the past, though these were often downplayed in the public eye. Riva, on the other hand, was known to have been unhappy with certain aspects of their relationship, particularly Oscar's controlling behavior. Still, like many couples, they appeared to be working through their issues in private, with Riva choosing to stay in the relationship despite the occasional tension. On that fateful night, Riva was staying at Oscar's home in the Silverwoods Country Estate, an upscale gated community in Pretoria, South Africa. The couple had been together for a few months, and despite some ups and downs, things seemed to be going well. Oscar had planned to spend the evening with Riva, and they had planned to enjoy a quiet evening together, as she had just finished working that day. She was looking forward to their time together, and the couple had made plans to have a relaxed night in. However, that night would take an unexpected and tragic turn. Around 3 a.m. on February 14th, Oscar fired 4 shots through a locked bathroom door, hitting Riva in the head, hip, and arm. He had mistaken her for an intruder, he later claimed, and in a panic, fired the shots. But was it really an accident? Was it truly a case of mistaken identity? Or was something much darker at play? Oscar's version of the events began to unravel almost immediately, leaving many to question whether his account of the shooting was accurate. In the hours following the shooting, Oscar called the police, frantically pleading for help. Riva, who had been struck multiple times by the bullets, was still alive when the paramedics arrived, but tragically, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The story of what happened that night and how the circumstances had led to her tragic death would soon be put under intense scrutiny. Oscar's initial explanation was one of confusion and panic. He claimed that he had heard strange noises in the middle of the night and, fearing for his safety, he grabbed his gun. Believing that someone had broken into his house, Oscar went to investigate. According to him, he called out to Riva to check if she was in the bed next to him, but there was no response. In a state of panic, thinking the intruder was coming toward him, he fired the shots through the bathroom door. It wasn't until after he fired that he realized it was Riva inside the bathroom. This story, however, was met with skepticism almost immediately. The circumstances didn't seem to align with the tragic narrative Oscar painted. The fact that the bathroom door was locked from the inside raised several questions. If Oscar had been genuinely terrified of an intruder, why would he shoot through the door, a door that was clearly inaccessible to anyone standing outside? Furthermore, there were inconsistencies in Oscar's own timeline, particularly around how much time had passed between hearing the noises and firing the shots. Many believed that the timeline didn't support his claims of fear and confusion. Moreover, when the police arrived at the scene, they discovered that Oscar had failed to immediately call for help for several minutes. His first action after the shooting seemed to be checking on Riva, but his delay in calling for assistance suggested that he was not in a state of panic, as he had claimed. Additionally, evidence of blood splatter inside the bathroom raised further doubts about Oscar's version of events. Riva Steenkamp's life was tragically cut short in an instant. She had so much to offer: an accomplished model with a growing career, a compassionate individual who cared deeply for others, and a woman who had so much more to give. Her friends and family were devastated by the loss of a bright, promising young woman whose future had been taken away too soon. The autopsy report confirmed the extent of Riva's injuries. She had been hit by 3 of the 4 bullets fired by Oscar, with one shot striking her head, another grazing her arm, and a final shot hitting her hip. The severity of the wounds, combined with the fact that Riva had no chance to escape or defend herself, painted a grim picture. The bathroom door, locked from the inside, had acted as a barrier to her escape, leaving her vulnerable and unable to flee from the danger. The violence of the attack and the reality of what happened made it clear that this was not a simple case of an accident. Friends and family members of Riva spoke out in shock and disbelief. Many close to her described her as someone who was always full of life, kindness, and warmth. She had a strong sense of independence and was passionate about her career, but she was also deeply loving and committed to those she cared about. Her tragic death left a void in the lives of those who knew her, especially her parents and friends. Her mother, June Steenkamp, who had always been very close to Riva, struggled to come to terms with the loss of her daughter. In interviews, June described the immense grief she felt, unable to reconcile the image of her daughter's bright smile with the horrific way she had died. June, like many others, was haunted by the possibility that the woman she had loved so deeply had been killed by the very man who should have loved and protected her. Oscar's defense team, while trying to maintain his innocence, painted him as a man overwhelmed by his own emotions. They argued that Oscar was in fear for his life, that he had acted out of sheer panic when he believed his home had been invaded. The defense played on the idea of Oscar being a vulnerable, disabled athlete who was highly sensitive to any threat, regardless of how minor it may have been. They painted a picture of him as a man who, in a moment of high anxiety, had made a tragic mistake, killing Riva without intention. But as the investigation unfolded, the evidence began to contradict much of Oscar's defense. His actions, both before and after the shooting, did not match the behavior of someone in genuine fear for his life. The fact that he had fired 4 shots at a locked bathroom door, despite claiming to be unsure of who was inside, raised questions. The inconsistency in his testimony, his delay in calling for help, and the lack of any real evidence of a break-in led investigators to consider a darker possibility: that the shooting had been premeditated and that Oscar's motivations were not as innocent as he had made them appear. As the investigation progressed, the case quickly became one of the most high-profile criminal trials in history. The public was captivated by the story of Oscar Pistorius, the Olympic athlete who had once been a symbol of triumph over adversity, now facing charges of murder. The media attention was relentless, with cameras following every move of the trial, the courtroom proceedings, and Oscar's every gesture. For many, the case was not just about a tragic loss of life. It was about the fall from grace of a man who had once been celebrated as a hero. Oscar had been adored by millions for his achievements as a Paralympic athlete, but now his image was tarnished forever. The trial sparked debates about fame, power, and the dark side of celebrity, as people around the world tried to reconcile the athlete they admired with the man accused of killing his girlfriend. Oscar's supporters continued to rally behind him, maintaining that he was innocent and that the shooting had been a terrible accident. But for the Steenkamp family, the grief of losing Riva was compounded by the pain of watching Oscar's actions unfold in public. The question on everyone's mind was whether Oscar Pistorius would ever truly be held accountable for his actions, or if his status as a world-class athlete would allow him to escape justice. The morning after the tragic shooting, as the sun began to rise over Pretoria, Oscar Pistorius's life changed forever. What began as a story of Valentine's Day romance quickly morphed into a tale of confusion, panic, and chilling discovery. In the early hours of the morning, the police arrived at Pistorius's home, responding to an emergency call made by Oscar himself, his voice full of desperation and disbelief. "I've shot my girlfriend," he reportedly said. "I thought she was an intruder." But as the police officers entered the lavish home, they were met with a scene that would haunt them for years to come. There, in the small, confined bathroom, lay the lifeless body of 29-year-old Riva Steenkamp. Her beautiful face, once full of life and promise, was now marred by 4 gunshot wounds. The tragedy that was unfolding before them seemed incomprehensible. Oscar, the man who had captivated the world as a hero and symbol of triumph over adversity, was now at the center of a heartbreaking and devastating crime. As officers began their investigation, the inconsistencies in Oscar's story started to surface. The more they uncovered, the more his version of events seemed to unravel, piece by piece. Oscar's initial claim, that he had mistaken Riva for an intruder, was a story he clung to tightly. He insisted that, in the dead of night, he heard sounds coming from the bathroom and feared for his life. He said he assumed an intruder had entered the house. According to Oscar, he grabbed his firearm, rushed to the bathroom, and fired several shots through the locked door in a blind panic, believing that someone was about to harm him. It was only after the shots were fired that he realized it was Riva who had been behind the door. But the more the police examined the scene, the less plausible his story became. For one, there was no evidence of a forced entry into the house. Oscar's security system was functional, and there were no signs that an intruder had been lurking around the house. Additionally, the bathroom door had been locked from the inside. If Oscar had truly believed there was an intruder, why would he fire through a door that was securely locked? Why wouldn't he call for help first or warn Riva? The forensic investigation began to cast even more doubt on Oscar's account. The positioning of the body, the trajectory of the bullets, and the nature of the injuries all suggested that the shooting was not as accidental as Oscar claimed. Riva had been struck in the head, and one of the bullets had pierced her arm before hitting her head. The path of the bullets indicated that she had likely been standing at the time the shots were fired. More troubling still were the accounts of those who had heard the commotion before the shots rang out. Neighbors reported hearing shouting coming from Oscar's house just before the shooting. The sounds were described as heated and intense, adding another layer of complexity to Oscar's version of events. If Oscar's account was to be believed, then why would there have been a confrontation before the shooting, one that had escalated to the point where he fired at someone he had thought was an intruder? Oscar's story, it seemed, was beginning to fall apart. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Oscar Pistorius's relationship with Riva had been far from perfect. While the media had portrayed them as a couple deeply in love, behind closed doors, things were different. Riva had been the victim of escalating tension and conflict in the months leading up to her tragic death. Friends and family described their relationship as one filled with moments of emotional volatility, manipulation, and secrecy. Riva's friends revealed that she had been open with them about her fears concerning Oscar's temper. She had confided that there were times when Oscar had been controlling and exhibited jealous behavior. Though Oscar had never shown this side of himself publicly, it seemed there had been a darker side to the relationship, one that was concealed from the world. Oscar's behavior was not just a matter of emotional instability. He had a history of outbursts of anger, some of which had been witnessed by others. There had been allegations of domestic violence in previous relationships, where he had been reported to have acted aggressively toward his partners. Riva's friends and family began to speak out, voicing their concerns that Riva had been the latest victim of Oscar's inability to control his emotions. The evidence was mounting that the shooting of Riva Steenkamp was not a simple, tragic accident, but rather the culmination of a deeply troubled relationship marked by manipulation, jealousy, and rage. As the details of the shooting began to emerge, the public's perception of Oscar Pistorius shifted dramatically. Once heralded as a hero and an inspiration to millions, Oscar was now viewed by many as a man capable of the unthinkable. His story, once one of overcoming adversity, had transformed into one of horror and betrayal. The man who had been celebrated for his determination and perseverance was now facing the wrath of a public that could no longer reconcile the image of the Blade Runner with the image of a murderer. Oscar's supporters remained vocal, defending him and continuing to believe in his innocence. They argued that the shooting was a tragic mistake, that Oscar had acted out of fear and confusion. Some even suggested that Riva's death was a result of an unfortunate series of events that spiraled out of control. But for many, the mounting evidence pointed to something far darker. The fact that Oscar had fired 4 shots through a locked door, each one hitting its target with deadly precision, made it hard to believe that his actions were purely out of fear. The emotional toll on Riva's family was unimaginable. Her parents, Barry and June Steenkamp, were devastated by the loss of their daughter, and they began to speak out against Oscar's behavior, urging the public to see beyond his fame and consider the reality of what had occurred. Riva had been a vibrant, beautiful woman with a promising career and a bright future, and her parents were determined to make sure her death would not be overlooked or forgotten. The media frenzy surrounding the case only intensified as new details were revealed, with sensational headlines and constant updates on every new development. The court proceedings became a spectacle, with reporters and cameras capturing every moment. For Riva's family, it was a painful reminder that their daughter's life had become just another headline, a tragic story to be consumed by the masses. In the months following the shooting, Oscar Pistorius was formally charged with the murder of Riva Steenkamp. The trial was set to be one of the most high-profile legal proceedings in South Africa's history. As the case progressed, the public continued to grapple with the evidence and the questions surrounding Oscar's motives. Was this a case of a man caught in a fit of rage, or was there something deeper at play? Something darker that Oscar had been hiding? The defense team argued that Oscar had acted in self-defense, that he had fired the shots in the belief that an intruder had entered his home. They painted him as a man who had been traumatized by the sound of an intruder breaking into his home, a man who had made a tragic mistake in the heat of the moment. They also suggested that Oscar's disability played a role in his fear and panic, claiming that he felt vulnerable and was unable to properly assess the situation. The prosecution, however, argued that Oscar had acted with intent, that the shooting was not an accident, but rather a deliberate act of violence. They pointed to the fact that Oscar had fired 4 shots, hitting Riva with deadly precision. They also highlighted the fact that the bathroom door had been locked from the inside, further suggesting that Riva had been trapped and helpless. The trial would continue to captivate the world, with both sides presenting their arguments and evidence in a battle for justice. The fate of Oscar Pistorius hung in the balance, and the question on everyone's mind was whether justice would be served, or whether the man who had once been a hero would escape the consequences of his actions. As the trial wore on, the Steenkamp family continued to honor Riva's memory. She was remembered not just as a victim of a senseless crime, but as a vibrant, intelligent woman whose life had been cut short. Her family worked tirelessly to preserve her legacy, advocating for domestic violence awareness and reminding the world of the woman Riva had been before the tragic night that stole her future. Riva's life had been a testament to strength, beauty, and love. Her passing became a stark reminder of the dangers of toxic relationships, the consequences of unchecked anger, and the heartbreaking reality that even the most celebrated figures can be hiding the darkest secrets behind closed doors. The days that followed the shooting of Riva Steenkamp were a blur of conflicting emotions for those closest to her. In the media, Oscar Pistorius was portrayed as a man in crisis, a tragic figure who had made a horrible mistake, while Riva's family and friends tried to piece together the painful reality that their loved one was gone forever. The investigation was only beginning, but the cracks in Oscar's story had already started to surface. Yet, what would follow would be an even more public and agonizing journey as both sides of the tragedy were examined under a microscope. For Oscar Pistorius, the next several months would be filled with increasing scrutiny, as the world tried to understand the man behind the gun, the hero who had fallen from grace. As the investigation continued, the police and prosecutors started to piece together a more complex and disturbing story, one that raised questions about Oscar's true nature. His reputation as the Blade Runner, the athlete who had triumphed over disability and adversity, began to crumble. The Oscar that had once captivated the world with his inspiring story now seemed like a shadow of his former self, his legacy forever tainted by the brutal death of Riva Steenkamp. For Riva's family, the process of grief was excruciating. Losing a loved one is never easy, but losing someone in such a violent, public, and senseless manner added a layer of complexity to their mourning. Her parents, Barry and June Steenkamp, would soon become the faces of Riva's memory, ensuring that the narrative surrounding her death did not overshadow the remarkable life she had led before that tragic night. Oscar Pistorius' trial began in March 2014, just over a year after the fatal shooting. What had started as a quiet domestic dispute had now become a spectacle watched by millions around the world. Every detail of the case was scrutinized. Every word spoken by Oscar and his defense team, every bit of forensic evidence, every testimony. The trial was an emotional roller coaster that tugged at the heartstrings of those who followed it, leaving no one unaffected by the heartbreaking and disturbing revelations that unfolded. The prosecution, led by advocate Jerry Nell, presented a case that painted Oscar not as a victim of circumstance, but as a man driven by anger and jealousy. They argued that the shooting was not a simple accident, but a premeditated act of murder. Nell emphasized the fact that Oscar had fired 4 shots at Riva through a locked door, shots that were not just haphazardly fired in panic, but were calculated and deliberate. The very act of locking the bathroom door behind her, as well as the severity and precision of the gunshots, suggested a chilling intent. The prosecution also highlighted Oscar's history of aggressive behavior, including previous incidents where he had lost his temper and acted violently. One key piece of evidence was an audio recording from a 911 call made by a neighbor, which captured the sound of shouting and what seemed like a confrontation shortly before the shooting. This added weight to the prosecution's argument that this was not a simple case of mistaken identity or fear. It was the culmination of a toxic, volatile relationship marked by unresolved tension, jealousy, and manipulation. Oscar's defense team, led by Barry Rue, countered these arguments with the claim that the shooting had been an honest mistake. They argued that Oscar, who was sensitive to the dangers of intruders due to his disability, had panicked when he heard a noise coming from the bathroom. They painted him as a man who was in constant fear for his safety, someone who, in the midst of a moment of terror, mistakenly shot Riva. According to the defense, Oscar had believed that an intruder had entered the house and, fearing for his life, had acted impulsively to protect himself. They also suggested that the emotional strain on Oscar's mind, dealing with his career pressures, his disability, and the complexity of his relationship with Riva, had contributed to the tragic events. They argued that Oscar had not intended to kill Riva, but that the shooting was the result of an unfortunate series of events that had spiraled out of control. However, the defense's portrayal of Oscar as a tragic hero who had simply made a terrible mistake did little to convince many observers. As the trial continued, emotions ran high. The witnesses, many of whom had heard the shots fired that night, were called to testify. The testimonies painted a picture of a chaotic, confused, and frightening night. But what became clear was that the more the court probed, the more the cracks in Oscar's story widened. One of the most devastating pieces of evidence against Oscar came from the testimonies of those who had witnessed the events leading up to the shooting. Neighbors testified that they had heard loud, aggressive shouting coming from the direction of Oscar's house. The argument had apparently escalated to a point where Riva's desperate cries could be heard, followed by the sound of shots being fired. Some neighbors said they had heard a woman's screams, which were later identified as Riva's, just moments before the gunshots rang out. What was striking was the repeated mention of shouting and what appeared to be a confrontation, not a situation of Oscar simply reacting to an intruder. The prosecution argued that this suggested a fight between the two, something that had likely been building for weeks, if not months. These testimonies painted Oscar's actions not as a momentary lapse in judgment, but as the culmination of a toxic relationship that had spiraled into violence. Further complicating Oscar's defense were the facts surrounding the gunshots themselves. Why had Oscar fired not once, but 4 times? The argument of self-defense seemed weak, given that he had continued to fire even after the first shot. The forensic evidence suggested that the first shot was aimed at Riva's hip, and the second at her head. The deliberate nature of these actions could not be dismissed so easily. If Oscar had truly been scared for his life, why had he continued to shoot? Why hadn't he attempted to escape, call for help, or warn Riva? The defense could offer no plausible explanation for the continued shooting. And as the trial progressed, it became clear that the public's perception of Oscar Pistorius had begun to shift. The hero athlete had now become the villain, a man who had destroyed his own life and the life of his girlfriend in one tragic, violent act. The trial of Oscar Pistorius lasted for several months, with both sides presenting their cases in painstaking detail. The evidence was overwhelming, and yet the jury and judge were tasked with determining whether Oscar's actions were those of a man in a moment of fear or a man consumed by jealousy and rage. In September 2014, after months of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Oscar Pistorius was found guilty of culpable homicide, a conviction that would come to define the case in the eyes of many. The judge ruled that he had been reckless, but not necessarily premeditated in his actions. Many were shocked by the decision. How could a man who had fired 4 shots into a locked door, killing his girlfriend in the process, be considered guilty of something as lenient as culpable homicide? For the Steenkamp family, the verdict felt like a slap in the face. They had lost Riva in the most violent, senseless way possible, and now they felt as though Oscar's actions were being downplayed. They had hoped for a verdict of murder, for a punishment that matched the severity of the crime, but instead, they were left feeling that justice had been diluted. Oscar Pistorius was sentenced to 5 years in prison for culpable homicide. But that wasn't the end of the legal battle. The public outcry was immediate, and many believed that Oscar's sentence was far too lenient given the severity of the crime. The South African justice system was thrust into the spotlight, with many calling for a harsher sentence. The Steenkamp family vowed to continue fighting for justice for Riva, and eventually, after an appeal, the verdict was amended to murder, and Oscar's sentence was extended to 6 years in prison. Oscar Pistorius's fall from grace was swift and brutal. The man who had once inspired millions of people, especially those living with disabilities, was now a convicted murderer. His sponsors, once eager to associate their brands with the athlete, began to distance themselves. His name, once synonymous with perseverance and triumph, became a symbol of tragedy and violence. Riva's family, while deeply wounded by the loss of their daughter, found solace in knowing that the case had sparked an important conversation about domestic violence, the consequences of unchecked aggression, and the need for accountability. They dedicated themselves to preserving Riva's legacy, ensuring that she would not be remembered just as a victim, but as a woman of grace, strength, and kindness. Riva's death had left a hole in the hearts of many, but it also served as a warning, a reminder that even those we admire, even those who seem invincible, are capable of darkness. And as Oscar Pistorius languished in prison, the world watched, hoping that justice, at least in part, had been served. Story 3. On a cold January afternoon in 1999, 18-year-old Heyman Lee walked out of Woodlawn High School in Baltimore, Maryland, for the last time. She was everything a parent could hope for in a daughter, brilliant, ambitious, and driven. With dreams of becoming a doctor, Hay embodied the American dream that her Korean immigrant family had sacrificed so much to achieve. Her infectious laughter could light up a room, and her sharp intellect made her a favorite among teachers and classmates alike. Hay was a senior at Woodlawn High School, months away from graduation and ready to embark on the next chapter of her life. She was actively involved in school activities, maintained excellent grades, and worked part-time to help support her family. Those who knew her described a young woman with an unshakable sense of responsibility and an unwavering determination to succeed. But on January 13, 1999, Hay's promising future came to an abrupt and violent end. After school that day, she simply vanished. Her white Nissan Sentra was found abandoned in a parking lot miles from the school, with no signs of struggle and no immediate clues about what had happened to the vibrant teenager. The discovery sent shockwaves through the close-knit community at Woodlawn High School and launched an investigation that would consume law enforcement for weeks. The initial search for Hay was extensive. Police canvassed the area, interviewed her friends and family, and followed up on every lead they could find. Hay's family was devastated, clinging to hope that she might still be alive somewhere, perhaps having run away or been kidnapped but still breathing. Her mother, young Lee, made desperate pleas to the public and the media, begging anyone with information to come forward. The search continued for over a month, with volunteers combing through parks, abandoned buildings, and any location where a missing teenager might be found. But on February 9, 1999, the worst fears of everyone who knew and loved Hay were realized. Her body was discovered in Leakin Park, a sprawling wooded area on the west side of Baltimore with a notorious reputation as a dumping ground for the city's most violent crimes. Hay's body was found partially buried in the woods, hidden beneath logs and debris. The autopsy revealed that she had been strangled manually, a brutal and intimate method of murder that suggested the killer knew her personally. The medical examiner determined that she had been dead for weeks, likely killed on or around the day she disappeared. The discovery transformed the missing person case into a homicide investigation, and the stakes suddenly became much higher. As detectives began their investigation into Hay's murder, they quickly focused their attention on the people closest to her. At the top of that list was Adnan Syed, her 17-year-old ex-boyfriend. Adnan was a popular student at Woodlawn High School, known for his charm, intelligence, and athletic ability. He came from a Pakistani-American Muslim family that had immigrated to the United States in pursuit of better opportunities for their children. Adnan and Hay had dated for about a year, their relationship becoming serious enough that they exchanged "I love you" declarations and spent significant time together both in and out of school. However, like many teenage relationships, theirs was complicated by cultural differences, family expectations, and the typical emotional turbulence of young love. The relationship had ended just a few weeks before Hay's disappearance, but by most accounts, the breakup had been amicable. Friends described seeing Adnan and Hay maintaining a friendship after their romantic relationship ended, and there were no reports of dramatic confrontations or threats. However, some classmates later told police that they had observed signs of jealousy and possessiveness in Adnan's behavior, particularly when Hay began dating someone new. Investigators learned that Hay had started seeing Don Kleindienst, an older man who worked at LensCrafters where Hay had a part-time job. The new relationship had developed quickly, and Hay seemed happy and excited about this new chapter in her romantic life. For detectives, this created a potential motive: a jealous ex-boyfriend unable to accept that his former girlfriend had moved on. Adnan's background added another layer of complexity to the investigation. Coming from a conservative Muslim family, his relationship with Hay had been conducted largely in secret. His parents would not have approved of him dating, particularly someone from a different cultural and religious background. This secrecy meant that Adnan had become skilled at maintaining a double life, presenting one version of himself to his family and another to his friends and girlfriend. The pressure of maintaining these dual identities had clearly taken a toll on Adnan. Friends and acquaintances described him as sometimes moody or stressed, though this was generally attributed to the normal pressures of being a teenager trying to balance family expectations with personal desires. However, investigators began to wonder if this psychological strain might have contributed to violent behavior. Baltimore police detectives faced significant challenges in investigating Hay's murder. The crime scene in Leakin Park had been contaminated by weather and time, yielding little in the way of physical evidence. There were no witnesses to the actual murder, no DNA evidence linking anyone to the crime, and no clear forensic trail that could definitively identify the killer. What they did have were Adnan's cell phone records from January 13th, the day Hay disappeared. Cell phone technology was still relatively new in 1999, and location data was limited compared to today's GPS tracking capabilities. However, the records showed a pattern of calls made from Adnan's phone throughout the afternoon and evening of Hay's disappearance, including calls that pinged cell towers near Leakin Park. The phone records became a crucial piece of the prosecution's timeline. According to their theory, Adnan had used his phone to coordinate the murder and disposal of Hay's body. However, the technology was imprecise, and the defense would later argue that the location data was unreliable and couldn't definitively place Adnan at any specific location. Investigators also discovered that Adnan had lent his phone and car to Jay Wilds earlier in the day. Jay was an acquaintance of Adnan's from school, though they weren't particularly close friends. This detail would prove to be pivotal to the case, as Jay would eventually become the prosecution's star witness. The investigation also revealed some concerning details about Adnan's behavior in the days following Hay's disappearance. While many of Hay's friends and family members were actively searching for her and expressing concern about her whereabouts, Adnan seemed relatively unperturbed. He didn't join search parties, didn't call Hay's house repeatedly like some of her other friends did, and didn't seem particularly worried about her absence. When detectives first interviewed Adnan, they found his responses somewhat odd. He claimed to remember very little about January 13th, describing it as just an ordinary day. For investigators, this seemed suspicious. If someone you had once loved had disappeared, wouldn't you remember every detail about the last day you saw them? The breakthrough in the case came when detectives interviewed Jay Wilds. Jay was an African-American student at Woodlawn High School who knew both Adnan and Hay, though he was much closer to Adnan. Initially, Jay told police he knew nothing about Hay's disappearance. However, as the investigation continued and pressure mounted, Jay's story began to change. In subsequent interviews, Jay made a shocking claim. He alleged that Adnan had murdered Hay and had asked for his help in disposing of her body. According to Jay's testimony, Adnan had called him on the afternoon of January 13th, asking him to pick him up from a Best Buy parking lot. When Jay arrived, he claimed that Adnan showed him Hay's body in the trunk of her car and asked for assistance in burying her. Jay's account was detailed and specific. He described following Adnan to Leakin Park, where they allegedly buried Hay's body together. He claimed that Adnan had killed Hay because he couldn't accept that she had broken up with him and moved on to a new relationship. According to Jay, Adnan had been planning the murder for some time and had involved Jay because he needed someone with a car and knowledge of where to dispose of a body. However, Jay's story was far from consistent. Over the course of multiple interviews with police, his account changed significantly. Details about timing, locations, and specific events shifted from one telling to the next. These inconsistencies would later become a major focus of criticism from Adnan's defense team and supporters who questioned Jay's credibility. Despite these inconsistencies, Jay's testimony provided investigators with something they desperately needed: a narrative that explained how and why Hay had been murdered. Without Jay's account, the case against Adnan was largely circumstantial, based primarily on his status as the ex-boyfriend and some questionable cell phone evidence. The prosecution believed Jay's testimony because it aligned with their theory of the case and provided details that only someone involved in the crime would know. Jay was able to lead police to Hay's car, which had been hidden in a different location from where her body was found. This knowledge seemed to corroborate his claim that he had been present when Hay's body was disposed of. Adnan's defense team faced an uphill battle from the beginning. The case had attracted significant media attention, and public opinion seemed to be turning against their client. The prosecution's narrative was simple and compelling. A jealous ex-boyfriend had killed his former girlfriend in a fit of rage when he couldn't accept that she had moved on. Adnan maintained his innocence throughout the investigation and trial. He claimed to have no memory of any unusual events on January 13th and insisted that he had never harmed Hay or asked Jay to help him dispose of a body. His family stood by him completely, describing him as a gentle, non-violent person who was incapable of murder. The defense strategy focused on challenging the reliability of Jay's testimony and questioning the validity of the cell phone evidence. They pointed out the numerous inconsistencies in Jay's story and suggested that he might have been coerced or incentivized to implicate Adnan falsely. They also argued that the cell phone location data was too imprecise to definitively place Adnan at the scene of the crime. One of the defense team's biggest challenges was Adnan's lack of a solid alibi for the crucial time period when Hay disappeared. While he claimed to have been at school and later at track practice, there were gaps in his timeline that couldn't be fully accounted for. This lack of a concrete alibi made it difficult for the defense to definitively rule him out as a suspect. The defense also struggled with the cultural aspects of the case. Adnan's Muslim background and the secretive nature of his relationship with Hay created a narrative that could be interpreted as suspicious. The prosecution suggested that the pressure of maintaining his double life and the shame of having his relationship discovered might have driven Adnan to violence. During the trial, the defense called several character witnesses who testified to Adnan's good nature and nonviolent temperament. Friends, family members, and teachers described him as kind, intelligent, and well-liked. However, these testimonials were difficult to weigh against Jay's specific allegations and the circumstantial evidence that seemed to point toward Adnan's guilt. Adnan Syed's trial began in early 2000, nearly a year after Hay's murder. The proceedings were closely watched by the local media and the Baltimore community, all eager to see justice served for the brutal killing of a promising young woman. The prosecution, led by Kevin Urich, presented a straightforward case built primarily on Jay's testimony and the cell phone records. They argued that Adnan had killed Hay in a premeditated act of jealousy and rage, then recruited Jay to help him cover up the crime. The prosecution painted a picture of a young man who couldn't handle rejection and had resorted to violence when his ex-girlfriend moved on to someone new. Jay took the stand as the prosecution's star witness, recounting his story of how Adnan had shown him Hay's body and asked for his help in burying her. Despite the inconsistencies in his various statements to police, Jay maintained his core claim that Adnan was the killer. His testimony was dramatic and detailed, providing the jury with a narrative that explained how the crime had been committed. The prosecution also presented evidence about Adnan's behavior after Hay's disappearance, suggesting that his relative lack of concern was evidence of his guilt. They argued that an innocent ex-boyfriend would have been more actively involved in searching for Hay and would have shown more emotional distress about her disappearance. The defense, led by Cristina Gutierrez, attempted to dismantle the prosecution's case by highlighting the inconsistencies in Jay's testimony and questioning the reliability of the cell phone evidence. Gutierrez was an experienced defense attorney with a reputation for aggressive cross-examination, and she went after Jay's credibility with determination. However, the defense's strategy had significant weaknesses. Gutierrez failed to call several potential alibi witnesses, including Asia McClain, a classmate who claimed to have seen Adnan in the library at the time when the prosecution alleged he was murdering Hay. This oversight would later become a major point of contention in Adnan's appeals. The defense also struggled to present a coherent alternative theory of the crime. Without being able to definitively prove that someone else had killed Hay, they were left trying to create reasonable doubt about Adnan's guilt without providing a satisfactory explanation for who the real killer might be. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury found Adnan Syed guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. The speed of their decision suggested that they had found the prosecution's case convincing despite its reliance on circumstantial evidence and inconsistent witness testimony. On February 25, 2000, Adnan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At just 18 years old, he faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars for a crime he maintained he did not commit. Following his conviction, Adnan began the long process of appealing his case through the Maryland court system. His initial appeals focused on claims of ineffective assistance of counsel, arguing that Cristina Gutierrez had failed to provide adequate representation during his trial. The appeals process moved slowly, with various legal challenges being filed and rejected over the years. Adnan's case seemed destined to become just another example of a convicted murderer exhausting his legal options while maintaining his innocence from prison. However, the case began to attract attention from journalists and legal advocates who believed that Adnan might have been wrongfully convicted. They pointed to the numerous problems with Jay's testimony, the lack of physical evidence connecting Adnan to the crime, and the failure of his defense team to present an adequate case on his behalf. One of the most significant developments came when Asia McClain came forward publicly with her account of seeing Adnan in the library on January 13th. McClain had written letters to Adnan shortly after his arrest, offering to testify about seeing him at the time when the prosecution claimed he was murdering Hay. However, Gutierrez had never contacted McClain or investigated her potential alibi testimony. McClain's account was potentially crucial because it directly contradicted the prosecution's timeline. If Adnan had been in the library when they claimed he was killing Hay, it would have been impossible for him to have committed the murder. The failure to investigate this alibi became a central focus of Adnan's post-conviction appeals. Legal experts began to examine the case more closely, identifying numerous problems with the investigation and trial. They questioned the reliability of the cell phone evidence, noting that the technology was still developing in 1999 and that the location data was far less precise than prosecutors had suggested. They also highlighted the problematic nature of Jay's testimony, pointing out that his story had changed so many times that it was difficult to know what, if anything, he was telling the truth about. In 2014, 15 years after Hayes' murder and 14 years after Adnan's conviction, the case exploded into the national consciousness with the release of the first season of Serial, a podcast hosted by journalist Sarah Koenig. The 12-episode series took a deep dive into the case, examining the evidence, interviewing key players, and raising serious questions about whether justice had been served. Serial was unlike anything that had come before in podcasting. Koenig's thorough investigation and compelling storytelling attracted millions of listeners who became invested in determining whether Adnan was guilty or innocent. The podcast didn't simply retell the story of the case. It conducted new interviews, uncovered previously unreported details, and presented the evidence in a way that allowed listeners to draw their own conclusions. The podcast's impact was immediate and profound. It sparked countless discussions on social media, inspired amateur investigators to conduct their own research, and brought unprecedented attention to the case. Many listeners became convinced that Adnan had been wrongfully convicted, while others maintained that the evidence still pointed to his guilt. Serial also had practical legal implications for Adnan's case. The publicity generated by the podcast helped attract new legal representation and funding for his appeals. It also brought forward new witnesses and evidence that hadn't been available during the original trial. The podcast raised troubling questions about the investigation and prosecution of Adnan's case. It highlighted the problems with Jay's testimony, the questionable use of cell phone evidence, and the failure of the defense to adequately represent their client. It also explored broader issues about the criminal justice system, including the potential for wrongful convictions and the challenges facing defendants who can't afford experienced legal representation. The attention generated by Serial led to renewed legal efforts on Adnan's behalf. His new legal team, led by attorney Justin Brown, filed comprehensive appeals that addressed the numerous problems with his original trial and conviction. In 2016, a Maryland judge granted Adnan a new trial, ruling that his original defense attorney had provided ineffective assistance by failing to cross-examine a key prosecution witness about the reliability of cell phone evidence, and by failing to contact Asia McClain about her potential alibi testimony. The decision was a major victory for Adnan and his supporters, who had spent years arguing that he had not received a fair trial. The ruling was based on several factors, including the discovery that the FBI had issued warnings about the reliability of historical cell phone location data. Warnings that had not been shared with Adnan's defense team during the original trial. The judge also found that Gutierrez's failure to contact McClain was unreasonable and potentially prejudicial to Adnan's case. However, the legal victory was short-lived. The Maryland Court of Special Appeals overturned the decision to grant a new trial in 2018, ruling that even if Gutierrez had contacted McClain, her testimony would not have changed the outcome of the trial. The court argued that the other evidence against Adnan was sufficient to support his conviction regardless of McClain's potential alibi testimony. The case continued to wind through the appeals process, with Adnan's legal team taking their arguments to the Maryland Court of Appeals, the state's highest court. Legal experts following the case noted that it had become a test case for questions about ineffective assistance of counsel and the standards that should be applied when evaluating whether defendants received adequate representation. Despite years of investigation, multiple legal proceedings, and intense public scrutiny, the murder of Hae Min Lee remains a source of controversy and debate. While Adnan Syed was convicted of the crime and remains in prison, questions about his guilt or innocence continue to divide those who have followed the case. Supporters of Adnan point to the numerous problems with his conviction. The inconsistent testimony of Jay Wilds, the questionable cell phone evidence, the failure of his defense attorney to present an adequate case, and the lack of physical evidence connecting him to the crime. They argue that these factors create more than reasonable doubt about his guilt and that he deserves a new trial with competent legal representation. Critics of Adnan maintain that despite the problems with the case, the evidence still points to his guilt. They note that he was the victim's ex-boyfriend, that he had potential motive for the crime, and that Jay's testimony, despite its inconsistencies, has remained consistent on the core claim that Adnan killed Hay. They argue that the case has been sensationalized by media attention and that justice was served with his original conviction. The case has also raised broader questions about the criminal justice system and the potential for wrongful convictions. Legal experts have used it as an example of how cases can go wrong. When investigations focus too quickly on a single suspect, when witnesses provide unreliable testimony, when defense attorneys fail to adequately represent their clients, and when courts are reluctant to overturn convictions even when significant problems are identified. For Hae Min Lee's family, the ongoing attention and legal proceedings have been a source of continued pain. They have maintained their belief in Adnan's guilt while expressing frustration with the prolonged legal process that has prevented them from finding closure. They have also noted that the focus on Adnan's case has sometimes overshadowed the memory of Hae herself and the tragedy of her death. As the case continues to evolve, with legal proceedings ongoing and public interest remaining high, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Who killed Hae Min Lee, and why? Was Adnan Syed the perpetrator of this brutal crime? Or is he an innocent man who has spent over 2 decades in prison for something he didn't do? The search for truth in this case has been complicated by the passage of time, the loss of evidence, and the unreliability of witness testimony. Many of the key players in the case have changed their stories over the years, making it difficult to determine what actually happened on January 13, 1999. Recent developments in the case have included renewed efforts to test physical evidence using modern DNA analysis techniques that weren't available in 1999. There have also been calls to investigate alternative suspects who may have had motive and opportunity to kill Hae, but were never thoroughly investigated by police. The case has also highlighted the importance of competent legal representation in criminal cases. Adnan's conviction was obtained despite what many legal experts now view as significant problems with the prosecution's evidence. His original defense attorney's failure to adequately investigate and present his case may have contributed to a wrongful conviction. The murder of Hae Min Lee and the conviction of Adnan Syed represents one of the most controversial and debated criminal cases of the modern era. What began as a local Baltimore murder case has become a national symbol of the potential flaws in the American criminal justice system. More than 2 decades after Hae's death, her family continues to grieve the loss of a daughter, sister, and friend whose life was cut short just as she was preparing to embark on her adult life. Their pain has been compounded by years of legal proceedings and media attention that have kept the case in the public eye. Adnan Syed remains in prison, still maintaining his innocence and continuing to fight for his freedom through the appeals process. His case has inspired broader discussions about wrongful convictions, the reliability of witness testimony, and the challenges facing defendants in the criminal justice system. The case of Hae Min Lee serves as a reminder that the pursuit of justice is often more complicated than it appears on the surface. It demonstrates how investigations can go wrong, how trials can be flawed, and how the search for truth can be elusive even when the stakes are highest. Whether Adnan Syed is guilty or innocent, the case stands as a testament to the complexity of the criminal justice system and the importance of ensuring that every defendant receives a fair trial with competent legal representation. It also serves as a memorial to Hae Min Lee, a young woman whose promising life was tragically cut short and whose death continues to raise difficult questions about justice, truth, and the price of getting it wrong. The story of Hae Min Lee and Adnan Syed may never reach a conclusion that satisfies everyone involved, but it will continue to serve as an important case study in the challenges of seeking justice in an imperfect system, and a reminder that the search for truth must never stop, no matter how difficult or elusive it may be. Story 4. On a hot summer afternoon in 1980, beneath the quiet suburban streets of Wiley, Texas, a shocking betrayal led to a murder so violent, it would shatter the lives of 2 families forever. Candy Montgomery, the seemingly perfect housewife, walked into her friend Betty Gore's home that day, leaving behind a trail of blood and an unforgettable crime. But what happened in that house? Was it a crime of passion or cold-blooded revenge? Join us as we unravel the twisted tale of betrayal, obsession, and murder that no one saw coming. In the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood in Wiley, Texas, the summer of 1980 was supposed to be just like any other. The lawns were freshly mowed, the children played outside until the streetlights flickered on, and the adults exchanged pleasantries across white picket fences. The Montgomerys and the Gores were well-known families in the area, seemingly living perfect, ordinary lives. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful community, something dark and destructive was unfolding. Something that would shatter the quiet lives of two families and send shockwaves through the town. Betty Gore, a 32-year-old mother of two, was a part of this idyllic suburban world. She was married to Alan Gore, a successful man who worked as an engineer. They had two young daughters, a house, and everything that society told them was the key to happiness. Betty, however, was not as happy as it might have appeared. Despite her outwardly perfect life, Betty struggled with depression and anxiety. She often felt isolated, and her marriage to Alan was under considerable strain. Candy Montgomery, on the other hand, was also a 32-year-old wife and mother who had recently moved to Wiley with her husband, Pat. They had two young children and lived just a few streets away from the Gores. Candy had become close friends with Betty, the two women having bonded over the shared experience of suburban life. They were both stay-at-home moms, both involved in church activities, and both seemingly well-adjusted on the surface. But just as Betty's life was marked by a quiet desperation, Candy's life had its own set of complications. Complications that would soon come to a tragic, violent head. It was a friendship between two women that would forever change the course of their lives, and that of the entire town. Behind the smiles, the casual conversations, and the church potlucks, a storm was brewing. It would end with bloodshed, betrayal, and a murder that would leave everyone in disbelief. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Betty and Alan's marriage had hit a breaking point. The couple had grown distant, and Betty's depression had only worsened. She struggled with feelings of inadequacy and isolation, and her marriage was no longer the source of comfort that it once had been. Betty often confided in her friends, including Candy, about the troubles she was facing at home. She expressed frustrations with Alan, the man who was supposed to be her partner, but who, in her eyes, had become emotionally unavailable. Candy Montgomery, meanwhile, had her own difficulties. She was in a marriage that, from the outside, appeared to be solid, but there were cracks. Candy had confided in Betty about her own unhappiness. Her husband, Pat Montgomery, worked long hours, and their marriage had become strained. Candy was feeling neglected, lonely, and unfulfilled. This sense of yearning for more, for something deeper, would soon find a dangerous outlet. Candy and Alan Gore began an affair. It started innocently enough, with shared moments of emotional vulnerability. Candy, needing the intimacy that her own marriage lacked, turned to Alan for comfort. Alan, disenchanted with his own relationship, found solace in Candy's attention. What began as a friendship soon turned into something much more. An illicit, passionate affair that took place in secret, away from the prying eyes of their families, their friends, and their church community. For a while, the affair seemed to give both Candy and Alan what they were missing. But for Betty, the discovery of her husband's betrayal would have devastating consequences. Betty, already struggling with her own mental health, found out about the affair through a series of subtle clues. The pain of this revelation pushed her over the edge, and the carefully constructed image of a perfect suburban life began to unravel. Betty's anger, frustration, and heartbreak began to boil over. She confronted Alan about the affair, demanding answers and resolution. Alan, though initially apologetic, was more interested in keeping the peace than addressing the deeper issues at play. His responses only fueled Betty's anger. In her mind, her entire world had been shattered by the person she trusted the most. She felt betrayed by the one person who should have been her partner, her protector. Meanwhile, Candy Montgomery's own emotional turmoil deepened. She was still involved in the affair with Alan, and the guilt and secrecy of it all weighed heavily on her. What started as a means of seeking love and affection had turned into a complicated web of deceit. Candy knew that she was living in a world of lies, but at the same time, the intensity of her feelings for Alan kept her trapped in this dangerous liaison. She knew that their affair could not continue forever, but it was hard for her to let go. For Candy and Betty, the emotional stakes were incredibly high. Candy was aware of Betty's growing suspicions, but she continued her affair with Alan, unable or unwilling to break it off. Betty, on the other hand, was now spiraling into a deep sense of betrayal, confusion, and anger. She could feel the pressure building, and it was becoming clear that something would have to give. Candy, for all her charm and ability to hide behind a friendly facade, had her own feelings of resentment building. She wasn't a stranger to emotional conflict, and as her relationship with Betty grew more strained, she began to sense the inevitable clash between the two women. The conflict between them was simmering beneath the surface, but it was hard to see just how quickly things could spiral out of control. July 13th, 1980, was a day that began like any other. Betty Gore spent the day at home with her children, keeping busy with household chores. She had no idea that this would be the day that would change everything. Candy Montgomery, who had continued to see Alan behind Betty's back, would soon find herself standing at the door of Betty's home, face to face with the woman whose life she had helped ruin. Candy arrived at Betty's house that afternoon, ostensibly to pick up a swimsuit that Betty had borrowed. The tension between the two women was palpable. Betty had learned of the affair, and while she had confronted her husband, there was still unresolved animosity and anger hanging in the air. The two women had spent a lot of time together in the past, but now, their friendship had turned into something more fraught with jealousy, hurt, and anger. At some point, the conversation turned confrontational. What happened behind closed doors in those final moments remains a mystery to this day. But in an instant, everything shifted. Betty Gore, in her emotional state, allegedly threatened Candy with a pickaxe. Perhaps in a moment of rage, perhaps out of a deep need to regain control over the betrayal that had rocked her world. It was a final outburst of frustration and anger that Candy could not escape. In a flash of panic, Candy Montgomery grabbed a weapon, Betty's own axe, and used it to defend herself. The violent altercation quickly escalated. Betty Gore was struck multiple times with the axe, each blow landing with brutal force, each strike fueled by desperation, fear, and a deep desire to end the conflict once and for all. In the chaos of that afternoon, Candy killed Betty Gore. The murder of Betty Gore sent shockwaves through Wiley. At first, no one suspected Candy Montgomery, but her emotions were not as easily hidden as she might have hoped. She went home, washed up, and returned to her normal life. But the seeds of suspicion were planted. Investigators began questioning those closest to Betty and Alan. Candy, already known as a friend of the Gores, became an immediate subject of scrutiny. During her interrogation, Candy Montgomery's story seemed plausible at first. She claimed that Betty had attacked her with the axe, forcing her to act in self-defense. But as the details emerged, the story seemed more complicated. The investigation uncovered the affair, the emotional turmoil that had been building for months, and the personal conflicts that had led up to that fateful day. Candy's version of the events, one of self-defense, didn't align with all the facts. There were conflicting accounts, physical evidence that seemed inconsistent with the story she told, and emotional undertones that pointed to something deeper. Was this really an act of self-defense, or had it been a crime of passion, a violent, uncontrollable eruption of anger and jealousy? The case quickly became a media sensation. Candy Montgomery, a seemingly quiet suburban housewife, was now at the center of a tragedy that no one had seen coming. Was she a victim of her circumstances, pushed to the brink by betrayal, or was she a cold-blooded murderer who had used her affair as a cover-up for something far more sinister? Candy Montgomery's trial was a spectacle. The defense argued that she had acted in self-defense, that Betty's anger had overwhelmed her, and that Candy had no choice but to protect herself from the violent assault. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They suggested that the murder had been planned and carried out in cold blood, driven by jealousy, revenge, and the desire to escape the consequences of her affair with Alan Gore. In the end, the jury found Candy Montgomery not guilty. The verdict shocked the community, but Candy was freed, her story still full of unanswered questions. The public was divided. Some believed she had killed in self-defense, while others believed that the truth of the murder was far more complicated. The case of Betty Gore's death and the subsequent acquittal of Candy Montgomery remains one of the most compelling, tragic, and controversial stories in Texas criminal history.
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. And be sure to subscribe for more calming true crime stories to accompany your peaceful nights. We've got many more stories waiting for you.